The reality, though, is that the diplomacy is really in the hands of the Americans. Whether the Americans decide to try and strike a deal with this regime, much the same way that they did with the authorities in Venezuela, is something that's entirely up to Trump. And Europe is not really at the negotiating table in that way.
The European Union has said it will classify Iran's IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, as terrorists over the slaughter of protesters. It's as Iran has warned it would defend itself and respond like never before if pushed after Donald Trump threatened a military attack with a massive armada moving towards the region. Yesterday, we broke the news that the US president said time is running out for Iran to negotiate a deal on its nuclear program. He went on to say a large fleet was on its way to the country. Well, let's get the latest with Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and the founder and CEO of the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation, an economics think tank focused on the Middle East and Central Asia. Welcome to The Times at 1. The EU's foreign policy chief has said the EU is expected to list Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation. What impact will that have?
I think it will have an impact certainly on the perception of Iranians outside of the country and also in Iran that has been an attempt to get some accountability for the tragedy that's unfolded in Iran over the last 6 weeks or so. There are few things that Western governments can do to really hold the Islamic Republic accountable, but this designation has been one of the moves that many groups have called for because it is a way of providing some degree of accountability. The challenge is that in practical terms, the designation itself is unlikely to have a meaningful impact on the operations or the financial circumstances of the Revolutionary Guard or the Iranian authorities. The reason for this is that there have been existing terrorism designations imposed by the United States, 2 of them, in fact, over the last 6 years. And it's those designations that have already significantly isolated the Revolutionary Guard from the global economy.
Do you think this forces, Keir Starmer's hand to do the same?
I think it's highly likely that the UK will move to make its own designation. There's a significant degree of coordination, of course, between the UK and the European member states of the EU around sanctions policy towards Iran. There had been an effort to kind of avoid making this move for some time because the E3 in particular, the UK, France, and Germany, were hopeful that there might be some space to engage in diplomacy with the leadership of the Islamic Republic to try and manage concerns around Iran's nuclear program, its missile program, its support for proxies, and of course, human rights in the country. But in the aftermath of the violence that we've seen and the repression of the recent protests,
yes,
it would seem that European governments see no pathway for that diplomacy, and so there's no cost in it making this designation.
I mean, do you agree with that there isn't a pathway for diplomacy? And now we are in an exchange, certainly rhetorically speaking, of sabre rattling at best or a real threat when Donald Trump says he hasn't yet made up his mind on whether to carry out a military strike against Iran.
I think a military strike from the US is highly likely. That is not in and of itself inconsistent with the idea that there may be some kind of diplomatic outreach. The reality, though, is that the diplomacy is really in the hands of the Americans. Whether the Americans decide to try and strike a deal with this regime, much the same way that they did with the authorities in Venezuela, is something that's entirely up to Trump. And Europe is not really at the negotiating table in that way. And so to the extent that political leaders in Europe are under pressure to do something to show that they take seriously what's transpired in Iran, given that there's no costs really in terms of actually pursuing this designation, it's an obvious choice for them to proceed with it. But the question of diplomacy is still an open one, and it really comes down to US priorities.
Right, that's the US. One advisor to the Ayatollah has said Iran's response will be all out, unprecedented. Can you sort of interpret that for us?
Iranian leadership sees themselves as engaged in a kind of existential fight. I mean, they see the recent events, the protests, the unrest, the pressure from the international community as basically a continuation of the war that transpired in June between Israel and Iran, in which the US was also a participant. And so understandably, given their sense that this is really in a final battle, which is actually a slogan that protesters have used on the streets in Tehran, they are trying to send a very strong message that they will fight back or retaliate in an attempt to establish some degree of deterrence to make the Americans think twice about expanding a military campaign against Iran. The reality is that, of course, if the US makes a decisive move to intervene militarily and to pursue regime change in the country,
Yes.
there's very little that the Islamic Republic, I believe, can do to forestall that regime change. The regime is in a weak position.
Yes.
The question for Western leaders is really, what will the cost of that be in terms of the disruptions and the instability that might emerge in the Middle East?
Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you very much.